Sam asked me to do a presentation that I usually do at libraries, and it's partly death by PowerPoint, but it's also the history of gangs in Melbourne. In gangs worldwide, Melbourne kind of has a special place. Because we started off as a penal colony, the people that came here to start off with, imagine it was like, I suppose, they opened up the doors of Pentridge or Tirana and let everybody out. And that was what it was like once all the prisoners started to come out. So that's correct, that's all they did was steal a loaf of bread. Anyway, so let's get started on the presentation. Feel free to heckle, shout out, correct me or whatever, because this is supposed to be would you like to come and help? Alright, so from the start they called it Marvellous Melbourne, and they promoted it worldwide as being a beautiful place to live, but they always wiped things over, whitewashed them and hid the slums and the people that they considered third class from the whole of the community. And it was during this time when the children started running amok in Melbourne. The reason why they could do it here and they couldn't do it in the UK is because they were cold and hungry.
Not you. You keep going.
They were cold and hungry in the UK, and when you're cold and hungry, you don't have much time to be running around running amok. But in Australia, because we had the sunshine, work, it made it easier for the kids to be kids. So one of the first gangs that sort of came here were the Parkhurst Boys. And it was like Tirana, it was an island somewhere. And some of the comments that I've got up there, accomplished little villains, graduates of the University of Rags, from the reservoirs of juvenile filth and depravity. That was what the establishment was saying about these young kids, who really hadn't done much at all except be poor and were pushed up in things. So they were kind of our first gang. Some of them, when they got off the boat, they just took off, and they were also all supposed to be apprentices. And in the Sharpie gangs, even in the 60s, they called the younger kids, the younger ones, their apprentices. So. And because there were so many males here, they decided they wanted some females. So they asked all the young teenage girls from Ireland to come over. And so they came. Some of them came on their own when they were about 16. That was a long way for a young teenage girl. But once they got here, once again the establishment hated them and said basically that they were prostitutes and they were going to give no benefit to society. But most of these girls actually worked as seamstresses, and like the Sharpies and being apprentices, they had money to spend on clothes. So these young women made their own clothes, and then they couldn't tell them apart from regular society. And regular society didn't like that. They preferred the lower class to be always lower class. So then the girls went on strike, and when they went on strike, then the blokes had no pants to wear. As usual, when you're from a class or a group that's being trodden on either by authorities or adults or whatever, you tend to band together. And as well as that, any children that were actually born in Australia, they were considered inferior, and they were called currency lads or currency children. What they were trying to say was we were pounds currency and the UK-born children were pounds sterling. So once again, they were just trying to make out anyone born in Australia was scum. So from that, there started being street gangs in Melbourne. This is a bit of an idea of what they would have worn. One of the main streets in the early days was the Burke Street Rats, and they would hang around the theatre area and try and sell yesterday's theatre tickets to theatre goers. And I could hear the girls laughing because they remember when we did that as West Side on the train. There was a free concert and the West Side Boys sold tickets to people on the train. So when the gang started hanging around Melbourne streets, there wasn't as much crime in those days. So the policemen who were all on foot at the time, they spent a lot of time arresting kids for swearing, whistling in the street, jostling, or just having fun. And when they arrested the leader of the Larrikins, they put him in Pentridge for something like only having 20 shillings in his pocket. And he said, never mind mates, I can do 12 months. The Larrikins absolutely loved going to Pentridge because when they got out, they had 3 square meals a day, and if they were doing hard labour, they came out muscular, nice and tanned, and they networked. They made friends with a lot of people and a lot of criminals around the area, so it only increased their standing when they got sent to prison. The name Larrikin is actually a Melbourne word. It was invented by a policeman who had a really strong Irish accent. And when he tried to say they were larking in the street, it came across as they were larrikin. And so, it's a word that's used around the world, but it's specifically Melbourne. So, and they also had their own clothes. So they also had their own clothing. Even back then, Melbourne and Sydney were bluing over who was the better larrikin, and when you look at their clothes, are exactly the same. And the girls always wore peacocky colours and anything to stand out. So a little bit more. So these are kind of some of the things that they would have worn. They had high boots and they had their own dances, their own songs. Basically, when you read the description that we can find in the paper about them, they sound a lot like Sharpies. The top hat in the corner, that was worn by the North Melbourne Crutch Push. A push was the name of the Larrikin Gang. All of these guys had were on crutches. So in North Melbourne, they'd go into one of the pubs in North Melbourne, and because there was no way of calling the cops, they'd go in there and they'd say to the publican, we want drinks and we want them now. And if the publican said no, they'd get their crutch and just swipe all the glasses and bottles off the things and take free drinks. And they used to go to the football and wear those top hats with North Melbourne streamers on it. So back then there was the connection between gangs and football like there is today. They also used to decorate their tiny little jackets with pearl buttons, and it was probably from the Pearly Kings in the UK, which you can look up if you want. So to combat this menace, they brought in 10 big thumping coppers and got them to chase down the Larrikins, bash them and arrest them. And even Ned talks about it takes 8 or 11 of the biggest mud-crushing cops to take down one little half-starved larrikin. So now we've sort of moved through to the 1920s, but the larrikins started in the 1850s and went right through to just after the 20s. So the most famous larrikin of all was Squizzy Taylor. And to combat him, they brought back in the Terrible 10. They were the younger constables that were under the sergeants from the previous lot, and they had to clean up the gangs. In the 30s, we had the Great Depression. There were still some gangs around in Melbourne, but the newspapers are only full of the poverty, so we don't know much about them. In the 1940s, well, of course, there was the war, so we don't know much about the gangs, but it was around this time after the war where the term teenager was invented in 1945, and that was when the children started to have, they could get jobs and they had their own money to buy clothes and music and whatever they wanted, which brings us through to the bodgies and the widgies. And bodgies, widgies and Sharpies are a variant of the bodgies. They said our clothes aren't bodgy, our clothes are sharp. And once again, they're specifically a Melbourne thing, although bodgies and widgies were also in New Zealand as well. There was a book called Bunch of Rat Bags, and it was written in the late 50s, early 60s by the leader of the Fitzroy bodgies. And when I read it as a 17-year-old, I think I kind of knew then that one day I'd be writing a book about gangs as well. Gangs go back in my family. This is my father in the bottom corner over there. He was part of a gang from Murrumbina, and he may have drunk at the pub that you drink at, Rob. Well, you used to, yeah. And this is another famous Sharpie. Where's Chuck? Yeah, so this is another Sharpie who had a bunch of mum and dad. And so the media, to try and get control over the teenagers, they tried to scare the parents by saying, if you let your daughters hang out with bodgies, they're going to be brought into a sex cult. And that's my mum, and she really looks like she was dragged into a sex cult. And that's my mum and dad again. I'm just going to bore you all now with family photos. One more, that was you know, the bodgie and the widgies down having holidays. And once again, the media just, they hated them. And it was always in there. There was panic in the streets. This is when you hear the term moral danger. That was when this started in the 50s because, you know, devil's music, rock and roll, young people having sex, they're not keeping it hidden, they've got money, they're out of control. So what did they do? They brought back the bodgie squad, but this time they had bikes, and usually they used to get blokes who were over 6 foot to, you know, to beat up the teenagers. Some of the Box Hill boys will like this one. One of the first diggy vans in the Box Hill police station. So I know there's people in this room who, you know, late at night, after they're missing the last train at Flinders Street, the cops might have picked them up, taken them back to the station and given them a bit of a whack around. It's been something that's always been unofficially approved since the beginning of Melbourne. And back then you can see, use a piece of rubber hosing to beat it out of them, beat the rebelliousness out of them, and then it won't break any heads. At the same time, they brought in the Child Welfare Act, and basically, if they suspected a young woman, a young teenage girl was sexually active, say if she was out late at night, and the police picked her up, if she was lucky, they'd ring her parents. If she wasn't lucky, they'd ring a social worker, and they'd do an assessment and decide, oh, we think she's having sex, we need to lock her up and remove her from her parents for her own good. And they were either put in, the girls were put in Winlayton and the boys were put in Tirana, but the percentages were 90% of girls in Winlayton were in there for the moral danger thing, only 10% of boys were in Tirana for moral danger.
How often were you locked up, Julie? How often were you locked up?
Never. And now we have some early 60s Sharpie fashion, and it's a lot different than the look that we had. So this is in the 60s, so if you imagine in the 60s, it's full of peace, love and hippies and all the long hairs, and that was who the media was concentrating on at that time, the long hairs. So the Sharpies were able to run around, be thugs, beat people up, do whatever they did and have fun, but no one noticed because they looked neat. So they went under the radar for quite a long time. There's some more early Sharpies. In 1966 there was a huge brawl in the city between the Sharpies and the mobs. And so what did the cops do? They brought back the special duty squad, and the average height was 6 foot and 13 stone. And that was to arrest the Sharpie menace and get them out of the streets of Melbourne again. In the early 70s, the look changed and when it became tails. Some of the first group I know of that may well have invented the tails were the Camberwell Sharps. This is them just before they had their hair cut. And this is after. So at this stage I do believe they may have been the first. That's just some of our Sharpie fashion. Earrings and jewellery, which was unisex, and I think Rod said to me it was unisex in the 60s, sorry, as well. Tattoos are a big part of the Sharpie culture. And once again, what did the police do? They brought a lot of police down just to, you know, round up a handful of kids. Some of those are in the room here today, not the cops, the kids. Of course, T-shirts if you were in a gang, but not all Sharpies were in gangs. Some were just in it for the fashion and the fun. Flinders Street's always been a big part of for all gangs in Melbourne. The early larrikins would have caught these. They were always trying to push them over or do something naughty. I think that man on the bottom right-hand corner it's got a bit of a stance in the look of the larrikin. And the later larrikins would have had the red trains. Then we had the bodgies. You can see a few bodgies on Flinders Street Station down the bottom right-hand corner. And if I'm using any images here that I shouldn't be, and you know, please come and tell me and I'll take them out. And they were lucky enough to have the blue trains. In the 70s, we had a few different Sharpie groups on Melbourne's Flinders Street. City Square, Sharps, De Grays and Flinders Street. A couple of them are in the room here today. And that lot, they were lucky enough to have the silver trains. And then there was my lot, which was Westside in the late 70s. We're nearly finished, don't worry. In the 80s, there were Sharpies still going. A lot of people might not realise that. I think part of the reason is because we were all driving by then. We weren't catching trains in the city anymore. I believe this might be the City Louts, which was late 80s, early 90s, and they also had a bit of a Koori branch as well. In the 90s, and it went to the punks, not the punks that we were in the early 80s, but the next generation. Then it went to the goths, and then from the goths it went to the scene kids, and they were colourful goths. And the young woman in the centre, what's her name? Sarah Obscene. She was the queen of scene. So, you know, once again, there's, you know, gangs coming up behind us. We don't know who's in Flinders Street at the moment. Maybe it's time for a new gang. So thank you for listening, everybody. Hope it wasn't too boring. So thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the bands and everybody that organised it. And I'll pass you back to Shane. Thanks.
Alright, the band will be on in about 5 minutes' time, so refresh your glass and we'll catch you on.